I will tell you a new exciting story.
The story you're about to hear is so incredible, so surreal, that if it weren't true, you'd think it was lifted straight from the script of a Hollywood thriller. With twists and turns so bizarre, even the best crime writers couldn't have invented a mystery like this. It begins in 1977 on the sun-drenched shores of Hawaii, a paradise that, for one unsuspecting family, turned into a nightmare. Mark Barnes and Charlotte Moriarty weren't a conventional couple. They weren't married, but that never mattered to them. Their love was as free-spirited as Charlotte herself. She was an artist, a dreamer with a restless soul, always seeking inspiration from the world around her. Mark, in contrast, was the steady force in their relationship, calm, patient, and devoted. A veterinarian by profession, he spent his days caring for animals, while Charlotte embraced life with a carefree, impulsive energy. Together, they had a 6-month-old baby boy named Marks, born into what should have been an idyllic island life, filled with warmth, laughter, and the soothing lull of ocean waves. But paradise often hides its darkest secrets. And on one seemingly ordinary day, everything changed. It was June 21st, 1977. The morning was warm, the air thick with the scent of salt and hibiscus. Mark was outside, tending to the garden, carefully planting flowers along the terrace he had built for Charlotte. It was a peaceful, uneventful day, until Charlotte casually mentioned she was heading to the store. There was nothing unusual about it. She placed little Marks in his stroller, kissed Mark goodbye, and strolled down the sunlit street. Hours passed. The sun inched across the sky. Mark, engrossed in his work, lost track of time. But then he glanced at his watch. She should have been home by now. The store was only a few blocks away. Where was she? At first, he dismissed his worry. Maybe she had run into a friend. Maybe she had taken the scenic route. But as more time slipped away, unease crept in. Finally, he set down his tools and walked toward the store, expecting to see her on the way. What he found instead made his blood run cold. Near a bus stop sat the stroller, empty, silent, alone. Charlotte and their baby were gone. Mark's heart pounded. His mind raced for explanations. Had she stepped into a shop, asked someone to watch the stroller? She'd be back any second, wouldn't she? But minutes turned to hours. No one returned. And then, something even stranger happened. Mark didn't call the police. He simply took the stroller and went home. Why? Because this wasn't the first time Charlotte had disappeared. She had a habit of vanishing for days without warning, wandering off on what Mark assumed were personal escapes. He had grown used to it, but this time was different. She had never taken their baby before, and she had never abandoned a stroller in the middle of the street. 2 days passed, 2 agonizing days of waiting, hoping. When Charlotte still hadn't returned, Mark finally called the police. But instead of launching a search, they told him to wait a few more days. It sounds unthinkable now, but in 1977, such cases weren't treated with urgency. They assumed Charlotte had left on her own and would come back soon. There were no signs of violence, no struggle. Why rush? Another 2 days passed. Mark called again. This time, the police took down descriptions of Charlotte and Mark's and promised to start looking. But something went terribly wrong. 3 weeks later, Mark, desperate for answers, walked into the station himself. He needed to know what progress had been made, but what he heard was beyond belief. "Sorry, but we have no record of your calls. You never reported them missing. What? Mark felt his stomach drop. He had called. Twice. He had begged for help. And now, the police were saying none of it had ever happened. That there was no record, no investigation, nothing. It wasn't just Charlotte and his son that had disappeared. The case itself had vanished. At that moment, fear took hold. What had happened to Charlotte? To Mark's? And why did it seem like no one cared? The questions gnawed at him. Had she been kidnapped? Had she run away? And if so, why leave the stroller behind? Every possibility felt worse than the last. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly imagined, was that this was just the beginning of a mystery far stranger than he could comprehend. A case filled with shocking discoveries, forgotten identities, and a truth that would remain buried for decades. And the most chilling part? No one could have predicted how it would all unfold. The case only became more confusing when Mark recalled strange episodes in Charlotte's behavior. He mentioned to investigators that she had once been walking around the house with a blindfold on. She couldn't explain why she was doing it, and it was unsettling. But soon after, she took the blindfold off and returned to normal, and Mark decided to brush it off. There was also the fact that Charlotte had been deeply upset when her daughter from her first marriage had her visit to Hawaii canceled. Mark believed that the negative emotions surrounding this might have triggered a mental health issue. By this point, it became clear neither the police nor Mark could explain what had happened. The police launched the usual search efforts, flyers, questioning, and seeking witnesses. But little came of it. No clues were uncovered. 2 years passed, and Mark began to lose hope. He moved to California, but the tragedy was always on his mind. Yet one question lingered in his thoughts. Where was she, and what had happened to his son? The years went by, and the case seemed all but forgotten. Mark had moved on with his life, building a new family, with 2 daughters from a second marriage. He had come to terms with the fact that he would never see Charlotte or his son again. The police had long since closed the case, and hope for finding any answers was fading. But then, in 2001, a sudden and unexpected twist changed everything. Charlotte's daughter from her first marriage, Jennifer, decided to take matters into her own hands. She traveled to Hawaii and, determined to uncover the truth, went straight to the police. Jennifer convinced the authorities to reopen the investigation into her mother's disappearance. The detectives agreed, and they added Charlotte and Mark's information into the missing persons database. They even created a computer-generated image of what Mark's might look like as an adult, based on his childhood photos. The investigation, however, took an unexpected turn. The first thing the police did was revisit Mark's behavior during the initial investigation. They were puzzled by how strange it had seemed that Mark had waited so long before contacting the police. According to the records, he hadn't even gone to the station until 3 weeks after Charlotte and Mark's vanished. This raised suspicions. Could Mark have been involved in their disappearance? To try and solve the mystery, the detectives decided to question him again, focusing on his relationship with Charlotte. An elderly neighbor who had lived near Mark and Charlotte's home at the time came forward with a striking detail. He remembered hearing the couple argue frequently. The detectives now believed they were closer than ever to solving the case and suspected Mark was guilty. They even asked him to take a polygraph test, but the results were inconclusive. Despite Mark's willingness to cooperate, the polygraph couldn't provide any clear answers. This left the detectives frustrated and uncertain of their next step. They then obtained a search warrant for the property where Mark and Charlotte had lived in 1977. Their primary focus was on the terrace, which had been built shortly before Charlotte and Mark's disappeared. The theory was that Charlotte had been killed during a domestic argument and buried beneath the terrace. The police brought in forensic teams to dig up the yard, hoping to find evidence of foul play. They spent 2 days digging, but they found nothing. No remains, no evidence. The current homeowners had to bear the cost of the search, but in the end, the investigation hit a dead end once again. Still, the police collected DNA samples from Jennifer and Mark, hoping they might be useful in the future. And little did they know that these samples would eventually lead them to the answers they had long been searching for. A decade passed, and the case remained cold. The search for Charlotte and her son seemed hopeless, and no new leads had emerged. But then, in 2011, a stranger's search for answers would ultimately unravel the entire mystery. Steve Carter, a 35-year-old man from Philadelphia, had always been curious about his past. He had grown up in an orphanage before being adopted by a wealthy couple when he was 4 years old. Though he loved his adoptive parents, Steve always wondered about his biological parents and how he had ended up in the orphanage. One day, while browsing the internet, Steve stumbled upon an article about a girl named Karina White. She had been kidnapped from a hospital as a newborn, and decades later had discovered her true identity through an online search for missing children. Steve was captivated by the story, and it stirred something deep inside him. Could his own story be similar? Driven by curiosity, Steve began his own search. He entered the details from his birth certificate into the same missing persons database, hoping for some answers. What he found left him utterly stunned. The very first result was a computer-generated image of a man, made from childhood photos, and it looked strikingly like him. It was an image of a grown-up Mark Barnes. After recovering from the shock, Steve decided to take a DNA test, submitting his sample to the missing persons database. To his amazement, the results came back after 8 months. He was a perfect match with the DNA samples collected from Mark and Jennifer. Steve Carter was, in fact, Mark Barnes. The revelation sent shockwaves through the police. The missing baby had resurfaced after 34 years. The authorities immediately reopened the case and began to investigate how Mark had ended up in Philadelphia, far from Hawaii. They discovered a crucial detail that would solve the mystery once and for all. Mark's birth certificate, which had been issued a full year after his birth, listed a different name, Tenzin Amia, and his mother's name as Jane Amia. This name had already appeared in previous police reports, and it connected the dots. Not long after Charlotte and Mark's disappeared, the police had received an unusual call from a woman claiming she had seen a young woman with a baby asking for milk. The police arrived at the scene and found Charlotte, but she was in a disturbed state. She was taken to a psychiatric clinic, and her baby was placed in state care. Charlotte, however, managed to escape from the clinic after a few days and she was never seen again. The baby, Mark, was left in the custody of the state. However, because he had no birth certificate and his family couldn't be identified, he was placed for adoption. The mystery, after all these years, was finally solved. Mark, now Steve Carter, was able to track down his half-sister, Jennifer, and his biological father, both of whom were stunned by the revelation. A baby who had vanished without a trace had grown into a successful man with his own family. The case of Mark Barnes, or rather Steve Carter, is one of the rare exceptions where a missing child was found alive after so many years. Although the fate of Charlotte remains unclear, the ending of this story was, at least for Mark, a happy one. As for the mystery of Charlotte's ultimate fate, that, it seems, may never be answered. And if you don't want to miss more gripping stories, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We bring you the most incredible and captivating investigations that make you reflect on life, fate, and unbelievable coincidences. Your like and subscription will help us make the content even more engaging and exciting. Tell us what you found interesting and share your thoughts with us. Your opinion matters to us.